In chapters 10 and 11, we will be relying upon the same tools and methods that we've been working with for the last few chapters. We will be dealing with samples, developing z-scores or t-scores, and running tests based on those. What really is changing here in chapter 10 is the way we frame the questions that we're interested in. So in chapter 9, we were largely interested in something in the population. So oftentimes a population mean that we are after, and we took a sample to be able to guess what we think the population mean is, and we took a best guess, and then we built a confidence interval around that. In chapter 10, we switch kind of the frame of that question, and largely what we're going to do in chapter 10 is test the validity of claims, or verify if a statement is true or not, or if we can reject a statement. Or another way to say that is we're going to be testing hypotheses. And so our process is going to change a little bit, and it's going to become a little more rigid. We're going to follow largely the scientific method. And so again, most of what we do mathematically here is going to be familiar. We're going to be manipulating those z formulas and later the t formulas, and applying percentages based on, say, the z table. And so really what we need to spend most of our time with here in chapter 10 is getting our heads wrapped around how we follow the scientific process and how we can apply our statistical methods to it. So we'll have a few videos about this as kind of we go along this process, and the book gives a nice infographic here, a 6-step process that we'll work through, and so we'll have a few videos. We'll start here with just basically step 1, but notice, just briefly looking at it, that our sampling is all the way at step 5. We do a little bit of the statistical work in step 4. But we don't get to what we've been working with until step 4 and 5. And so these first 3 steps are equally important. So we'll walk through those now. So the first step is to state our null and alternative hypotheses. And this is the important step where we set up what we're about to test. And so it can take a few times to kind of get your head wrapped around how we lay these out, but a few ways to think about it. So number 1, again, I think it's often helpful to think of these as claims or statements that we are going to try to test. And so again, thinking of chapter 9, we may have said something like, I wonder what the mean income is in our community. Whereas here in chapter 10, we are responding to some type of a claim. So maybe you either think it is, or maybe a close friend of you, or it doesn't have to be a close friend. Maybe a politician says the mean income in our community has increased and it's now 52,000, or it's at least 52,000. Let's say the politician says the mean income is at least 52,000. What we're thinking about here is, how do we test that claim? Is that an accurate statement? And again, what we're eventually going to do is take a sample to test that. But first, we want to set up how we're going to think about whether or not this statement is true. So we're going to separate it or outline it in 2 statements. We're going to have a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. And largely, what the statement that we are going to test is going to be the null hypothesis. We're going to refer to that, or we're going to label that as HO, or 0. 0 being the null. Okay, so the null hypothesis here is that mean income, and oftentimes we'll abbreviate this, but I'll write this out for the first one. The mean income is at least 52,000. Okay, and And so we have our null hypothesis. On the flip side, though, we are always going to have an alternative hypothesis. Okay, and so again, the null hypothesis is the statement that we are about to test, or we're setting up to test. The alternative would be mean income is less than 52,000. And so this brings up the first important point, is that we need to match our null and alternative, or they need to be counterpoints. Okay, so much like, or I should say, so the null hypothesis includes at least 52,000, so it will be 52,000 or more, and so then the alternative is going to be less than. So I said we often abbreviate, and oftentimes what we do is we write it in terms of just the mathematical notation. So we could just write this as the mean is greater than or equal to 52. I'll just also abbreviate it as K. And the alternative then would be the mean is less than, I don't know why my mu looks so funny there. The mean is less than 52,000. Okay, so again, this is that important distinction that we need to make sure that, you know, these don't conflict. We can't have, you know, equal to on both sides. So that's, but in general, this is the way we're going to lay out step one. And next, and we'll go through a few more examples, but really we're setting this up so that we can then say, let's take a sample. Is there enough evidence to say that the null is false? Or we reject the null, I should say. Is there enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis? So it might be helpful to see a few more examples. Okay, so let me just grab this. And okay, so we have our mean income. We might think about other questions or other scenarios where we might want to test a hypothesis. So, for instance, perhaps we work on an assembly line, or in a plant, and we want to make sure that the products that we are producing are of the correct size. So maybe we produce, we're producing. I'm gonna say we're making chopsticks, because that should be easy to draw. Okay, and we want them to be roughly the right length. Okay, and so we may want to test whether or not these are coming out at 10 centimeters. Does that seem reasonable for the length of a chopstick? So we're going to test the idea that the mean is 10 centimeters. Okay. The alternative here is going to be that the mean is not 10 centimeters. Okay, so notice now there's a difference in the way we've set up the equation here. In our chopstick example, we are wanting the mean to be right on a number. In our mean income, the statement was the mean income was greater than or equal to 52,000, or is at least 52,000. And so that included all values above 52,000. Here, our null is about 10 centimeters. And so that means that anything that gives us evidence that it's not 10 centimeters in either direction would give us evidence towards rejecting the null. Okay. Other ones we might want to set up. Well, we'll go through some more examples. Another thing that might be helpful is to put it in something that's not directly kind of a statistical test. So we can set up null and alternative hypotheses for all, kind of situations. And one that might be helpful to talk about specifically when we move on to step 2 is that of OJ is innocent. Okay, OJ being the running back who was accused and of murdering his wife from back before many of you were born. And so we might set up the null hypothesis being that OJ is innocent. And largely this is what we do in our criminal justice system, is we have the assumption that the accused is innocent. So the null hypothesis is innocence. And hopefully this kind of gives you a frame of reference as to which claim are we putting where. Okay, so we're always assuming, or one thing we want to do is assume that the null hypothesis is correct. And then what we will do is build a system where we can then test if we have enough evidence to reject that null. So there may be cases where it doesn't make a lot of sense. So maybe OJ being innocent is one of those. But for instance, you could set up, if you had a friend that said, I think the mean height on campus is the mean. Let's see. If you had a friend say the mean height on campus is 5'2", however many inches it is. What is that? 62 inches. We know that's probably an outlandish claim. Okay, but we would still set it up and say we think the mean height is 62 inches. Okay, so it's not, the null hypothesis is not giving any indication as to what we think may or may not be true. Or I should say, we might go into this assuming, or I don't want to use the term assume, we might go into this kind of anticipating that there will likely be enough evidence to reject the null. But when we're setting it up, we what we're trying to do is give as much credit to the statement as we can, so as to not presuppose or force it to be incorrect. So we're going to give it kind of the benefit of the doubt in some sense, right? And that's, again, why it might be helpful to think about this in terms of criminal justice. We give the benefit of the doubt to the statement that the person is innocent, and then we test those claims given the evidence. So this is how we set up null and alternatives. We'll have some more practice with this as we go. And as we turn into step 2 and talk about level of significance, I think it'll become more clear as to kind of how we treat the null and the alternative and what we're looking to do.